What are some of the reasons why behaviorism emerged when it did? And who are some of the individuals that contributed to its expansion? In the early 1900s, psychology and introspection were synonymous. Many people outside of the field assumed that all psychologists used introspection, and many of them did. This is one of the reasons why Ivan Pavlov detested psychology. He did not consider it to be a real science because it relied too heavily on methods like introspection. In addition, American psychologists like Cattell and Watson were becoming dissatisfied with the method. They weren't able to study some of the things that they wanted to study using introspection. If you're interested in studying animals and drawing conclusions about humans based on the results of your animal studies, how are you supposed to do that if you use introspection? You can't ask rats, primates, cats what they experienced. They wanted to get rid of introspection altogether. Behaviorism did this. Behaviorists did not use introspection ever. And because of this, because behaviorists and the typical American psychologist shared a distaste for introspection, it made American psychologists more amenable, more open to learning about behaviorism and all that it has to offer. There are two major weaknesses of introspection that make it a less than desirable method for studying human psychology. Number one, because it is a subjective method, the information cannot be verified. Only you know what you're thinking and feeling, and I can't say any different. I can't say that's not how you are feeling, but I also can't verify it. Behavior is more observable, and multiple people can observe a single behavior in order to verify it. The other problem with introspection was that it became so complex that participants had to be trained in order to partake in the study. That is not ideal. Today, if we had to train every single participant, our studies could potentially take double the time. Some of you may not know this, but the typical psychology experiment takes several years to plan, conduct, and then publish. In many cases, the participants were also the researchers. Behaviorism was very different. It required that the experimenter and the participant be two different roles. Participants could not be the experimenter, and the experimenter could not participate in their own studies. Reason number two, Americans' desire for practical, applicable products and services. We've talked about this in previous lectures. This zeitgeist, this climate of the times, was very important to both the emergence and the success of behaviorism as a school of thought. Had it not been for this American value, this desire for things that are useful, things that are worth the money, things that make our lives easier, if it had not been for this idea, behaviorism may not have caught on when it did, because that's exactly what behaviorism was focused on. They were focused on predicting and controlling behavior, both in animals and in humans. One of the reasons behaviorists pivoted from studying animal behavior to human behavior is because the American public sort of demanded it. When Americans found out that some of this research was being conducted on animals, there was this general sense that that wasn't going to cut it. So behaviorists started studying human behavior in order to understand human psychology. Who would have thought, right? Study the human in order to understand the human. Like the applied psychologists, behaviorists also used their principles to try to solve real-world problems in educational settings, business settings, legal settings, and even in terms of addressing issues in the war. Americans' pragmatism in the early 1900s also played a role in the development of applied psychology. Same pressures were on both perspectives. This is a picture from New York City in the early 1900s. At about the time that applied psychology, Gestalt psychology, and behaviorism, even functionalism for that matter, that all of these ideas were being tested, and psychologists in the United States were becoming more familiar with these different ideas. I like to show images like this because I want to give you a feel for what those times were like. There were massive waves of immigration. There were all kinds of new things being invented, new products, new services. There were buildings being built, roads being built. There were manufacturing plants popping up all over the country. This progressive era was a time of progression. There were a lot of things being invented, created, developed. It's no wonder then that psychology kind of followed in those footsteps and began expanding and creating new ideas within itself. This is how we get behaviorism, because all of these ideas are sort of competing with one another, and behaviorism is essentially the one that wins during this time period. Now, applied psychology sticks around, it doesn't go away. It eventually becomes a subfield. Behaviorism is a perspective that permeates all subfields of psychology. Behavior, behavior, behavior. Behaviorists focused on behavior. Who contributed to the development of behaviorism? John B. Watson is known as the founder of behaviorism. There were other people studying animal behavior and human behavior at the time. Absolutely. 1913, John B. Watson was not the first person to do this, but he was the loudest promoter. He talked about it everywhere he went. He talked about it in magazines. He talked about it on the radio. He talked about it with his colleagues. He traveled all over the country to different universities, given different speeches. He published books, articles not only in journals, but also in magazines that the typical American would read. He devoted his entire life to promoting behaviorism. This is one of the reasons why he gets credit as its founder. He was not the first, but he was certainly the strongest and loudest promoter of all of them. So behaviorism did not develop from the work of one individual, despite the fact that we give Watson this title of founder. At the bottom of the screen, you see a very simple timeline that doesn't have any dates, illustrating the progression of behaviorism. It actually began with Pavlov's classical conditioning studies. Thorndike's instrumental conditioning studies with cats and puzzle boxes also played an important role. Watson conducted numerous animal studies and helped promote the field. Then we have three individuals by the name of Guthrie, Tolman, and Hull. All three of these are considered pioneers in behaviorism. And finally, we have Skinner, who was responsible for studying operant conditioning. All of these individuals and many, 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 many more helped promote behaviorism in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. Here is a simple timeline of some of the most important studies in behaviorism. We have Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning studies in the 1890s. We have Thorndike's puzzle box studies in 1898. In 1905, he published his Law of Effect, which we've learned about in a previous lecture. In 1920, Watson published the results of his Little Albert studies. In 1938, Skinner published some of his operant conditioning studies. In 1965, Bandera published his Bobo doll studies, and then several years later, He finished his social learning theory and published it in 1971. You can see that in 80 years, we went from studying drooling dogs to studying real people in real situations and emphasizing the environment, the social environment, and how it impacts behavior.